It started like any other Thursday. The baby had just gone down for his nap, and the house was finally quiet. I'd planned to enjoy that rare peace by tackling a mountain of dishes in the sink. Domestic life, right? But then the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be a delivery or one of those door-to-door salespeople. If only it had been something so trivial. Instead, I opened the door to a man who looked as if he had walked off the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Sharp suit, expensive watch, and a smirk that sent a chill down my spine. He leaned casually against the doorframe as if he belonged there. "Are you Ryan?" he asked, like he already knew the answer. "Who's asking?" I replied, not bothering to hide my irritation. I wasn't in the mood for whatever game this guy was playing. "Let me introduce myself," he said smoothly, as though he were pitching a business deal. "My name is Evan Carter. I'm your wife's lover." I froze, gripping the door harder than I realized. The words didn't register at first. Surely, I'd misheard him. But then he leaned in closer, lowering his voice like he was about to share a secret. "She's carrying my child," he said, his tone dripping with confidence. "And by the way, she's been paying for my luxury condo with your money." I couldn't speak, couldn't think. For a moment, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. I had no response, no clever retort to counter the absurdity of what he was saying. Instead, I just stared at him, trying to make sense of the words coming out of his mouth. He took my silence as an invitation to continue. "Look, man, I thought you deserved to know. She's been telling me all about your so-called perfect marriage, but clearly, it's not so perfect, is it?" That smirk. That damn smirk. It was as if he was enjoying every second of this, like he got a thrill out of dropping this bombshell on me. "You're lying," I managed to say, though my voice sounded weaker than I'd intended. He shrugged, pulling out his phone. "I've got proof if you need it. Photos, texts, whatever you want." She's been pretty generous with the details. I didn't look at the phone. I didn't need to. The way he spoke, the casual arrogance in his tone, told me he wasn't bluffing. But even then, I couldn't fully process what he was saying. My wife? Pregnant with his child? Using my hard-earned money to fund his lifestyle? "Why are you here?" I asked finally, my voice sharper now. "What do you want from me?" Evan smiled, leaning in just enough to make me want to punch him. "Closure," he said. "I figured you deserve to know what's really been going on. And hey, maybe this will save you some time. No need to waste energy on a woman who clearly doesn't respect you." I wanted to slam the door in his face. I wanted to wipe that smug expression off his face with a single punch. But most of all, I wanted to wake up and realize this was all some twisted nightmare. Upstairs, the baby stirred in his crib, a soft sound that grounded me for a moment. I glanced toward the stairs, my protective instincts kicking in. Whatever this man's motives were, I wasn't going to let him disrupt my son's peace. "I think you've said enough," I said, stepping back and gripping the edge of the door. Evan chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Suit yourself, Ryan. But if you ever want the full story, you know where to find me." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping me upright. As the door clicked shut, I felt a surge of anger so intense it left me shaking. My wife's lover? My money? A pregnancy? The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. But beneath the shock, a cold, focused fury began to take shape. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood there, hands still resting on the doorknob long after Evan left. The nerve of him, showing up at my house, smirking like he owned the place, or worse, like he owned my life. My first instinct was to chase after him, drag him back by the collar, and make him regret every word he said. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and closed the door. There was no way I was giving that man the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. Not yet. The house was quiet again, aside from the faint creak of the crib upstairs. Dylan was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. I envied him. For a brief moment, I let myself wonder how my wife could risk tearing this all apart. Dylan's tiny laugh, his first steps, the bedtime stories we read together. Were none of those moments sacred to her? But I couldn't linger on those thoughts. Not now. I needed clarity, not emotion. Walking to the kitchen, I grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter. My mind replayed the interaction at the door in agonizing detail, dissecting every word Evan had said, every smug glance he gave me. Was he telling the truth? Or was this some cruel, elaborate prank? I considered calling her. Right then and there, dialing her number and demanding answers. But what would that accomplish? If she was guilty, she'd deny it. If she wasn't, I'd look like a fool for believing a stranger over my wife. No, I needed more than words. I needed proof. So, I did what any rational person would do in my position. I started digging. First stop, her phone. She always kept it on the kitchen counter when she left for work. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands like it was Pandora's box. Unlocking it was easy. Her passcode hadn't changed in years. The messages were clean. Too clean. There were no texts from Evan, no suspicious threads that would back up his claims. But I knew better than to take that at face value. The photos told a different story. There they were. Photos of her and Evan at a dinner table, glasses of wine between them, their faces closer than they should have been. Another of them on a balcony, a sunset stretching behind them. The kicker? A blurry shot of them in what looked like a luxury condo. She was laughing, and he had his arm around her waist. I put the phone down, my stomach churning. I moved to her laptop next. She rarely used it, which meant she probably hadn't thought to cover her tracks there. Sure enough, the browser history painted a damning picture. Searches for luxury condos near downtown, prenatal yoga classes, and, God help me, how to tell your husband about your affair. It wasn't just the affair that stung. It was the arrogance. The audacity to plan her next move while still pretending everything was fine at home. Still, I kept my cool. No yelling. No punching walls. That wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I kept digging, piecing together every lie, every betrayal. Financial records were next. I pulled up our joint accounts on my phone, scrolling through transactions I didn't recognize. High-end restaurants, boutique shopping sprees, payments to a leasing company I'd never heard of. It all added up to one glaring truth. Evan hadn't been lying. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon. Dylan had woken up and was happily playing with his blocks on the living room floor, blissfully unaware of the chaos his father was unraveling just a few feet away. I sat on the couch, watching him, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. Not the peaceful kind, but the calm before a storm. The kind where every detail sharpens, every move becomes deliberate. I knew one thing for sure. Evan Carter had come here expecting to rattle me, to break me. He'd expected me to lash out, to crumble under the weight of his revelations. But that wasn't going to happen. No, I'd play this smart. I'd gather every piece of evidence, document every lie. When the time came, I wouldn't just confront her. I'd dismantle the entire web of deceit she'd spun around me. She wanted to play games? Fine. But she'd underestimated the man she married. By the time she walked through the door that evening, I had transformed into someone I didn't recognize, a man with absolute clarity of purpose. The chaos I felt earlier had settled into something cold and calculating. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me in ways I could barely comprehend. But tonight, I wouldn't let her see the cracks. Not yet. "Hey, love," she said as she dropped her bag on the counter, leaning in for the usual kiss. I let her peck my cheek, fighting the urge to flinch. Dylan's laughter floated in from the living room, cutting through the tension like a cruel reminder of the life we'd built, or the illusion of it. "Long day?" I asked, my voice steady, even casual. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Exhausting. Clients were a nightmare." I nodded, watching her closely. "Sounds rough. Wine." She looked at me, surprised. "That's sweet of you." "Sure." I poured her a glass, each movement deliberate. As she sipped, I studied her. Her relaxed posture, the way she smiled as she asked about Dylan's day. It was almost impressive how effortlessly she played the role of devoted wife and mother. Almost. Dinner passed in much the same way. We laughed about Dylan's antics, talked about work, and made plans for the weekend. All the while, my mind raced, replaying the evidence I'd found earlier. The photos, the receipts, the damning browser history. It was all there, staring me in the face, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had the full picture. After dinner, as she gave Dylan his bath, I slipped upstairs to her closet. My heart pounded as I rifled through her things, looking for anything that could confirm what I already knew. At first, it seemed like I wouldn't find anything. Just clothes, shoes, the usual. But then, tucked inside a shoebox at the back of the closet, I found it. A stack of papers and envelopes bound with a rubber band. I sat on the floor and sifted through them, my stomach tightening with every page. Hotel receipts, credit card statements, even a handwritten note from Evan, signed with a smug "yours, always." My hands shook as I read each line, the weight of her betrayal crushing me. She hadn't just been careless. She'd been bold, brazen, as though she thought I'd never figure it out. I put the papers back exactly as I found them and returned downstairs just as she was tucking Dylan into bed. The sight of her kissing his forehead, her face soft with maternal love, made my blood boil. How could she do this? To me? To our son? Did she even care about the life she was destroying? When she came downstairs, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone. She plopped onto the couch beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm exhausted," she murmured, her voice tinged with affection. "Can we just watch something mindless tonight?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure." As we watched a rerun of some sitcom, I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of her performance. To sit there, laughing at jokes, as though everything was normal. As though she wasn't actively tearing our family apart. But I played along, letting her believe I was none the wiser. That night, after she fell asleep, I got back to work. Her phone was my first stop, and this time I wasn't looking for messages or photos. Instead, I checked her apps, her email accounts, her payment notifications. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, a payment schedule for the condo Evan had mentioned. She'd been using our joint account to cover the rent, funneling the money through a secondary account I didn't even know existed. Next, I turned to her laptop. This time, I dug deeper, searching for deleted files and hidden folders. And there it was, a folder labeled "Work Stuff," buried so deep it was almost laughable. Inside were screenshots of text conversations with Evan, photos of them together, and, most damning of all, a draft email to a lawyer about divorce proceedings. The subject line read, "Timeline for separation." I sat back, staring at the screen, my chest tight with a mix of rage and disbelief. She wasn't just cheating, she was planning her escape, and she was funding it with my money. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my emotions. The betrayal, the humiliation, the anger. It all hit me at once, leaving me breathless. But even in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let her win. She might think she had the upper hand, but she was wrong. She'd underestimated me, and that was her biggest mistake. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The rage was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it had transformed into something useful, something focused. I wasn't going to lash out in anger. I was going to dismantle the web of lies my wife had spun, thread by thread, until she had nowhere left to hide. As she left for work, kissing Dylan on the cheek and offering me a smile that made my stomach turn, I stayed silent. I nodded, played my role, and waited for her to drive off. Once she was gone, I got to work. First, I called my lawyer, Mark Reynolds. Mark had been my friend since college, and while I never thought I'd need his services in this way, he was the first person I trusted to guide me through this storm. "Mark, I need your help," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Of course. What's going on?" he asked, concern lacing his tone. I laid it all out for him. Evan's visit, the condo, the affair, the financial discrepancies. He listened quietly, asking pointed questions when necessary. By the time I finished, I could hear him taking notes furiously. "This isn't just about infidelity, Ryan," he said after a pause. "This is about fraud. If she's been using your money without your consent to fund this other life, that's a legal issue. We need to act fast." Mark's words gave me a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about confronting her. It was about protecting what was mine. Dylan, our finances, the life I'd worked so hard to build. She wasn't going to take that away from me. Mark advised me to gather as much evidence as possible, so I spent the rest of the day digging deeper. I printed out bank statements, flagged suspicious transactions, and compiled screenshots of her texts, emails, and receipts. Every piece of evidence went into a folder, each item another nail in the coffin of her deception. But I wasn't just preparing for legal action. I was preparing for the moment she walked through that door. I wasn't going to yell or argue. No, I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done, to understand that she couldn't lie her way out of this. By late afternoon, the house was quiet again. Dylan was napping, the soft sound of his breathing a reminder of why I was doing all of this. He was innocent in all of this, and I wasn't going to let her selfishness ruin his future. At 6:15 p.m., I heard her car pull into the driveway. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I sat at the dining table, the folder of evidence in front of me, and waited. When she walked in, she looked surprised to see me sitting there. "Hey, you're not cooking tonight?" she asked, dropping her bag on the counter. "Not tonight," I said evenly. "We need to talk." Something in my tone must have tipped her off, because her smile faltered. "What's going on?" I gestured to the seat across from me. "Sit down." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the folder. "Ryan, what is this?" "Sit," I repeated, my voice firm but calm. After a moment, she complied, her movements cautious, as though she were already bracing for what was coming. I opened the folder and slid the first page across the table. It was a printout of the payment schedule for the condo. "You recognize this?" Her face paled, but she didn't say anything. "Let me help you out," I continued, pulling out the next page, a screenshot of her text with Evan. "How about this? Does this jog your memory?" "Ryan, I can explain." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "No, you've been explaining for months, haven't you? All those late nights at work, the extra expenses you conveniently forgot to mention. It was all just one big lie." She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, a printout of the email she drafted to her lawyer about divorce proceedings. "And then there's this. Your timeline for leaving me. Very thorough, by the way." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. "Ryan, please, I was going to tell you." "When?" I snapped, my calm exterior finally cracking. "When you drained our accounts. When you'd packed your bags and left me to pick up the pieces. Or maybe when Dylan was old enough to ask why his mother walked out on him." She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly. "This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated betrayal. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt our family." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the wall. Then, she looked up, her expression shifting from guilt to defiance. "You don't understand." "No," I interrupted. "You don't understand. This isn't just about you and Evan. This is about our son, our life, and the trust you've destroyed. And believe me, you're going to pay for it." I stood, taking the folder with me. "Dylan and I are staying with my parents tonight. When I come back, I'll have divorce papers. And trust me, they'll be very thorough." She called after me, begging me to stay, to talk, to listen. But I didn't stop. I was done listening. As I packed Dylan's things and carried him to the car, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, the lies were over. Now, it was time to take back control. The next morning, I woke up in the guest room at my parents' house. Dylan was still asleep, curled up next to me with his favorite stuffed giraffe. The weight of everything hit me all over again. The betrayal, the lies, the man who had stood on my doorstep and dared to flaunt my wife's infidelity. It wasn't enough to just walk away from this. Evan Carter had played his part in this mess, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I'd spent most of the night organizing the evidence I had against him. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. This man had been living in a luxury condo that I was paying for, eating at expensive restaurants with my money, and even daring to show up at my house as if he were untouchable. Well, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The first thing I did was call Mark, my lawyer. "Mark, I need you to help me with something, I said, my voice steady despite the fire burning inside me. This isn't just about the divorce anymore. It's about the guy she's been seeing, Evan Carter. Mark didn't need much convincing. I'll look into him, he said. If he's been benefiting financially from your wife's actions, we can make this very uncomfortable for him. Do you have any concrete evidence tying him to your accounts? Plenty, I said, thinking of the receipts, bank statements, and photos I'd collected. I'll send everything over. After hanging up, I decided to take things a step further. I didn't just want legal action. I wanted Evan to feel the consequences of his arrogance in real time. So, I called a private investigator. I need you to find out everything you can about a man named Evan Carter, I told him. His work, his habits, his connections, everything. The investigator was efficient. Within hours, he called me back with information that made my blood boil. Evan wasn't just a smug lover playing house with my wife. He was a con artist, a man who had a history of targeting married women for financial gain. He had a trail of failed relationships, all ending with women left in financial ruin while he walked away unscathed. That was the final straw. I wasn't going to let him skate by this time. The next step in my plan was direct. I knew where he lived, the luxury condo that I had unknowingly paid for, and I knew he'd be there in the evening. So, I waited until it was dark, then drove to the address with Mark and the private investigator. When we arrived, I stood outside the building, staring up at the windows. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure Evan Carter never pulled a stunt like this again. We took the elevator up to his floor, my heart pounding with every step. Mark carried a folder full of evidence, ready to serve him a legal notice that would hit him where it hurt most. His wallet. When he opened the door, his smug smile faltered. He wasn't expecting me, let alone the entourage I'd brought with me. Ryan, he said, recovering quickly. What a surprise. Not a pleasant one, I'm sure, I said, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk. Evan crossed his arms, leaning casually against the wall. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I know everything, I interrupted. The condo, the dinners, the money. I have the receipts, Evan. Literal receipts. He hesitated, his confidence wavering. Look, man, this is between you and your wife. Wrong, I said, my voice cutting through his excuse. This is about you leeching off my hard work. You thought you could just walk into my life, take what's mine, and get away with it? Not happening. Mark stepped forward, handing him the legal documents. You're being served, he said, his tone professional but firm. These documents outline the financial damages you've caused and the restitution you'll be expected to pay. I suggest you read them carefully. Evan's smirk disappeared entirely. Restitution? He echoed, his voice rising. You can't be serious. Oh, we're very serious, I said. You've been living off my money, Evan. Every dollar you've spent, every meal, every luxury, came from my account. You're going to pay it all back, and if you don't, we'll see how much you enjoy explaining yourself in court. For the first time, Evan looked genuinely nervous. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Mark pulled out a second folder. This contains everything we've uncovered about your past, Mark said. If you try to fight this, we'll make sure your history comes to light. Every scam, every scheme. It'll all be public record. Evan's face turned pale. He knew he was cornered. Get out, he said finally, his voice low and defeated. Take your papers and get out. I stepped closer, staring him down. Oh, I'm leaving, I said. But don't think for a second that this is over. You wanted to play games with my life? Congratulations. You've lost. As we walked back to the elevator, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a victory. Evan Carter had walked into my life thinking he could take whatever he wanted, but now he was the one paying the price. And I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The aftermath of that encounter with Evan Carter was satisfying, but it was only the beginning. Taking him down was one thing. Dealing with my wife and the mess she created was another. If I wanted a clean break from all of this, I needed to ensure that every single loose end was tied up, legally and financially. I wasn't just protecting myself, I was protecting Dylan's future. The day after serving Evan, I met with Mark in his office. He had been working tirelessly, digging through every financial transaction my wife had made in the past few years. What he uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. She's been using joint funds for more than just the condo, Mark began, laying out a stack of documents on his desk. These transactions show payments to Evan directly, thousands of dollars over several months, not to mention extravagant shopping sprees, vacations, and private expenses that she never disclosed. I stared at the documents, feeling a mix of fury and betrayal. How much are we talking about here? Mark tapped a figure on one of the papers. Close to $200,000. This isn't just infidelity, Ryan. This is fraud. She's been systematically draining your accounts to support her double life. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. What are my options? Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. We can pursue this in the divorce proceedings. With the evidence we have, you can argue for full custody of Dylan, significant financial restitution, and potentially even criminal charges for the misuse of funds. But there's a risk. What risk? He hesitated. If this goes public, it could get ugly. She might try to paint herself as the victim, claiming emotional distress or some other excuse. And then there's Dylan. A messy court battle could impact him, even if he's too young to understand what's happening. I nodded slowly, the weight of it all settling on my shoulders. I don't care about the public. I care about Dylan. He's the only reason I'm doing this. Mark nodded, pulling out another folder. I've drafted the initial paperwork for the divorce and custody arrangements. We'll present her with the evidence and see how she responds. If she fights back, we'll escalate. The next step was confronting her. Not in anger, not with shouting or accusations, but with cold, hard facts. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. That evening, when she came home, I was waiting for her again. This time, I didn't bother with small talk or pleasantries. As soon as she walked through the door, I handed her the folder of evidence. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Everything," I said simply. "Every dollar you've stolen, every lie you've told, every betrayal you've committed. It's all there." She opened the folder, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. I watched as her face changed, confusion, disbelief, and finally, panic. "Ryan, I can explain." "No," I interrupted. "You don't get to explain. You've had months, years, to come clean, and you didn't. You lied to me, to Dylan, to everyone. This is the result of your choices." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. I was beyond sympathy. "Ryan, please," she whispered. "I made mistakes, but I love you. I love Dylan. We can fix this." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Fix this? You've been living a double life, siphoning money out of our accounts to fund your affair. You've betrayed me in every way possible. How do you fix that?" She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said firmly. "This isn't something you can apologize for. You've destroyed everything we built together." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. But her tears didn't move me. I handed her another folder, this one containing the divorce papers. "You'll sign these," I said. "You'll give me full custody of Dylan, and you'll agree to financial restitution. If you don't, I'll take this to court, and trust me, I have more than enough evidence to ruin you." Her head snapped up, her expression shifting from sorrow to defiance. "You can't do that," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't take my son away from me." "Watch me," I said coldly. "You put him at risk the moment you brought Evan into our lives. You used money meant for his future to fund your lies. You don't deserve him." For a moment, she just stared at me, her face pale and her breathing uneven. Then, as if realizing the futility of her position, she nodded. "I'll sign." I felt a surge of relief but didn't let it show. "Good. Mark will be in touch with your lawyer. From now on, everything goes through them. You'll hear from me when it's time to finalize the custody agreement." She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she slumped into a chair, defeated. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As I walked out of the room, I felt a sense of closure. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long, difficult process. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. My wife's lies had nearly destroyed me, but I wasn't going to let them define me. Not anymore. This was my chance to rebuild, to protect Dylan, and to ensure that neither my wife nor Evan Carter ever had the power to hurt us again. And I wasn't going to waste it. The house felt eerily quiet in the days following her signature on the divorce papers. Dylan's laughter echoed faintly from the playroom, a welcome contrast to the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to every other corner of the house. My wife, or should I say ex-wife, though not officially yet, had retreated into herself. She'd signed the papers without a fight, but her demeanor told me this wasn't over in her mind. She tried, of course, to talk, to reason, to rewrite the story. But every time she approached me, I made it clear. There was no coming back from what she had done. "Ryan, can we talk?" she asked one evening, her voice soft and hesitant. She stood in the doorway of the living room, wringing her hands like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. I didn't look up from my book. "There's nothing to talk about." "Please," she insisted, taking a tentative step closer. I need you to understand." "Understand what?" I snapped, finally meeting her eyes. "That you lied to me? That you lied to us? That you stole from your own family to fund a life with another man? What exactly am I supposed to understand?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel the usual pang of guilt. Not anymore. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said sharply. "You hurt me. You hurt Dylan. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a series of calculated choices. Don't stand there and pretend you're the victim." She flinched at my words but pressed on. "I know I messed up, but I love Dylan. I love you." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't you dare say you love me. You don't do this to someone you love. And as for Dylan, you're lucky I'm even letting you see him." Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't soften. I couldn't. Not after everything. "I want to make it right," she said desperately. "Please, Ryan, tell me how to fix this." "You can't fix this," I said coldly. "The damage is done. The only thing you can do now is accept the consequences of your actions." For a moment, she just stood there, her shoulders trembling as she cried. Then, as if realizing the futility of her pleas, she turned and walked away. The next morning, she tried again. This time, it wasn't tears but desperation that drove her. She cornered me in the kitchen as I was making breakfast for Dylan. "I'll do anything," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I'll give you full custody. I'll move out. I'll even stop seeing Evan. Just please, don't take Dylan away from me." I sighed, putting down the spatula and turning to face her. "It's not about Evan anymore," I said. "It's about trust. And you broke that. I can't trust you to put Dylan first when you've spent months putting yourself first." "But I've changed," she insisted. "I've realized how wrong I was. Doesn't that count for something?" I shook my head. "Not to me. Maybe, in time, you can rebuild something with Dylan. But you don't get to skip over the consequences just because you regret them now." Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse. "I never thought it would go this far," she whispered. I thought I could have both." "Both?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "You thought you could have a husband who trusted you, a son who adored you, and a lover on the side? You thought you could drain our accounts, lie to my face, and still keep the life we built together? What kind of fantasy were you living in?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the floor as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. "I loved you," I said, my voice quieter now. "I trusted you with everything, and you threw it all away for him. For some smug con artist who didn't even care about you." Her head snapped up at that. "He cared about me." I laughed bitterly. "Did he? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he cared about the money you were giving him. Tell me, has he reached out since I served him with those papers? Has he offered to help you pick up the pieces?" She didn't answer, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. Evan had abandoned her the moment things got tough, just as I'd predicted. You made your choices, I said finally. Now you have to live with them. Over the next few weeks, she tried every tactic in the book. Apologies, promises, tears, but none of it changed anything. I stayed firm, focusing on Dylan and the future I was building for us. One afternoon, as I was packing some of her things into boxes, she came into the room, her face pale and drawn. I'm leaving, she said quietly. I've found an apartment. I looked up, surprised. That was fast. I figured it's what you wanted, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. You've made it pretty clear there's no place for me here. There isn't, I said bluntly. Not anymore. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I'll still see Dylan, right? I hesitated, but eventually nodded. Supervised visits, as per the agreement. But that's all. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. I'm sorry, Ryan. For everything. I didn't respond. I just watched as she turned and walked out of the room, carrying the weight of her choices on her shoulders. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, the house felt like mine again. Like ours, mine and Dylan's. She was gone, and with her, the lies and betrayal that had poisoned our lives. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the one she had chosen. And now, it was time to move forward. The day she moved out was quiet. Too quiet. Dylan was at my parents' house, happily oblivious to the turmoil his father was navigating. I stayed behind, overseeing the movers as they carried out the last of her belongings. Her absence left the house feeling oddly hollow, like a stage after the actors have left and the lights have dimmed. Yet, for the first time in months, I felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in, peace. As soon as the door closed behind the movers, I took a deep breath and looked around. The house was still standing, despite everything. I walked through the rooms, noting how different they felt now. The living room, once a space of shared laughter and quiet evenings, felt neutral, like a blank canvas waiting for a new story. The kitchen, where I'd prepared countless meals for her and Dylan, no longer carried the weight of her lies. It was just a kitchen, a place to cook, to create, to rebuild. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, not because it needed it, but because I needed it. Scrubbing away the stains of her betrayal felt cathartic, like I was reclaiming my home, one room at a time. I boxed up the last of the photos of us together and tucked them away in the attic. I didn't have the heart to throw them out yet, but I couldn't bear to look at them either. This house was no longer ours. It was mine, and Dylan's. By the time my parents brought Dylan home, I had transformed the living room into a play area just for him. His blocks were neatly arranged on the rug, his favorite stuffed giraffe sat on the couch, and a new shelf was stocked with books and toys. When he toddled into the room, his eyes lit up with delight. "Dada!" he squealed, running to me with his arms outstretched. I scooped him up, holding him close. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked, gesturing to the room. "This is all for you." He clapped his little hands, a wide grin spreading across his face. For a moment, all the stress and anger melted away. This was what mattered. Not the betrayal, not the lies, but this, a happy, healthy son who needed me more than ever. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into building a life that revolved around Dylan. I reorganized my work schedule to spend more time with him, ensuring he had the stability and love he deserved. Weekends were for trips to the park, pancake breakfasts, and lazy afternoons building towers with his blocks. Nights were for bedtime stories and whispered promises that no matter what, I'd always be there for him. But it wasn't just about Dylan. I had to rebuild myself, too. The betrayal had left scars, but I refused to let them define me. I started therapy, something I never thought I'd need, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made. Talking through the pain, the anger, and the lingering doubts helped me see things more clearly. I wasn't just a victim of her betrayal, I was a survivor of it. I also threw myself into work, channeling my energy into a new project that had been sitting on the back burner for years. It felt good to focus on something productive, to see the fruits of my labor take shape. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again. Not the man I was before her betrayal, but someone stronger, someone wiser. Then there was the matter of friends and family. At first, I hesitated to tell anyone the full story. It felt embarrassing, like admitting I'd failed somehow. But as word got out, I was surprised by the support I received. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering kind words and encouragement. My parents, who had always been a source of strength, stepped up in ways I couldn't have imagined. They became an integral part of Dylan's life, giving him the love and attention he needed while I focused on rebuilding. Even Mark, my lawyer, became more than just a legal guide. He became a confidant. Over beers one night, he said something that stuck with me. "Ryan, you've been through hell, but you didn't let it break you. That says a lot about the kind of man you are." I held on to those words, replaying them in my mind during the darker moments. They reminded me that while the betrayal had been devastating, it hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, still fighting for a better future. One evening, after Dylan had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, staring at the blank wall where our wedding photo used to hang. I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the confrontation, the fallout. For months, I had been consumed by anger and hurt, but now, for the first time, I felt free. I realized that the house no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility. It was a place where Dylan and I could create new memories, free from the shadow of betrayal. A place where we could laugh, grow, and heal. As I sipped my coffee, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let the past define me. I wouldn't let her actions dictate my future. Dylan deserved better, and so did I. The fresh start wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 9 and 10. Resolution and reflection. Months turned into a year, and life finally settled into a rhythm that felt normal. Not the old normal, but a new one. One built on trust, resilience, and an unshakable bond between me and Dylan. The chaos that had consumed me, the betrayal, the lies, the anger, was now just a chapter in my story. The pages had turned, and a new narrative had begun. The divorce was finalized quietly. She didn't fight. How could she? The evidence was overwhelming, and she knew it. She signed the papers, agreed to supervised visits with Dylan, and promised to repay the money she had drained from our accounts. It wasn't enough to fix everything she had destroyed, but it was a start. Her visits were sporadic at best. At first, she tried to show up regularly, bringing gifts and flashing forced smiles, but Dylan didn't respond the way she hoped. Toddlers are intuitive in a way adults often overlook. He clung to me, wary of her presence, treating her as though she were a stranger. Her guilt was palpable, and over time, her visits became less frequent. One day, after an uncomfortable drop-off, she lingered by the door. "Ryan," she began hesitantly, "does he even remember me?" I turned to face her, studying her defeated expression. "He's young," I said evenly. "He remembers the people who are there for him. That's what matters to him." Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't have the energy to console her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. My priority was Dylan, protecting him, nurturing him, and ensuring he grew up in a stable, loving environment. Life without her was simpler, freer. I threw myself into my consulting business, which had grown from a fledgling idea into something substantial. It felt good to focus on building something new, something entirely my own. But more than that, it gave me the freedom to spend time with Dylan. Our days were full of joy. Morning pancakes with syrupy smiles. Afternoons at the park, where his laughter echoed louder than the swings creaking. Evenings spent reading books until his eyelids drooped. Every moment reminded me why I had fought so hard to protect him. I wasn't just building a life for myself. I was building one for Dylan, too. A life free from lies and betrayal. A life full of love, trust, and the promise of a brighter future. One afternoon, as Dylan napped, I found myself scrolling through old photos. There we were, the three of us, smiling at the camera, a picture-perfect family. But as I looked closer, I could see the cracks I'd missed before. The forced smiles, the distant glances. Those images weren't memories anymore. They were remnants of a life I no longer recognized. Without hesitation, I deleted them all. It wasn't an act of anger or bitterness, but one of release. Those moments didn't define me anymore. They didn't define us. Dylan and I were building something new, and I didn't need those photos weighing me down. A few weeks later, an email from Mark arrived in my inbox. Final restitution payment received. It was over. Officially. Legally. Financially. I closed my laptop and walked to Dylan's room, where he was stacking blocks into an elaborate tower. "Hey, buddy," I said, crouching beside him. "What are you building?" "Castle, Dada," he said proudly, his little face lighting up with excitement. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "A castle for a king, huh?" He grinned, nodding enthusiastically. In that moment, I realized something. The life I had now wasn't just a fresh start. It was the life I was always meant to have. A life where I was free to be the father Dylan needed. A life unburdened by lies. One evening, as I tucked Dylan into bed, he wrapped his tiny arms around my neck and whispered, "Love you, Dada." My chest tightened with emotion. "I love you too, buddy," I said softly. As I walked out of his room and into the quiet house, I sat on the couch with a cup of coffee and let the stillness wash over me. The house, once filled with tension and betrayal, now felt like a sanctuary. I thought back to everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the legal battles, and felt an odd sense of gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the strength it had revealed in me. I had faced the worst and come out stronger, more determined to create a better future for my son. Dylan's giggles and first words, the way he looked at me with complete trust, those were the moments that mattered. Not the betrayal, not the lies, just the love we shared and the life we were building together. Freedom wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing it. It was about learning from it, using it to shape a better path forward. I wasn't just free of her lies. I was free to live, to grow, and to give Dylan the life he deserved. As I sipped my coffee, I looked out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The storm had passed. The scars remained, but they didn't define me. They reminded me of what I'd overcome. This was our life now, mine and Dylan's. And for the first time, I felt at peace, free.